Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Therapist Theater. It's the podcast that takes a look at relationships and mental health through the lens of movies, TV, and pop culture. I'm your host, Josh Treese. I've got a master's degree in marriage and family counseling and therapy, and I'm a practicing therapist in Music City, USA. I'm on a mission to help people more easily understand mental health and relationships and help break down the stigmas surrounding counseling and therapy. And that's why every week, a guest therapist and I talk about a movie and what relationship or mental health issues it highlights. Thanks so much for downloading today's show. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes, and while you're doing that, help other people find the show by giving it a 5-star rating and writing a review for it in the podcast app. Today in the theater, my guest is Joshua Pease. Joshua is a freelance journalist with bylines with The Washington Post, New Republic, Think Christian, Fathom Magazine, Relevant Magazine, and Christianity Today magazine. He also oversees communications and staff development at a church in Colorado. He and I met while working at a church in Southern California, so both of us are coming from the perspective of a Christian faith worldview. And parts of our conversation involve us discussing aspects of that, especially because so much of Joshua's writing involves sexual abuse within the church. So I wanted to make sure that I mention that up front, just in case you have any kind of aversion to discussions involving Christianity. On a side note, I'm hard at work on Season 2 of Therapist Theater, which is premiering on Thursday, January 9th, 2020. And one thing I'm trying to be mindful of is having guests on who represent different faith and spiritual perspectives. Joshua brought with him 2001's A Beautiful Mind. IMDb says about it, at Princeton University, John Nash struggles to make a worthwhile contribution to serve as his legacy to the world of mathematics. He finally makes a revolutionary breakthrough that will eventually earn him the Nobel Prize. After graduate school, he turns to teaching, becoming romantically involved with his student Alicia. Meanwhile, the government asks his help with breaking Soviet codes, which soon gets him involved in a terrifying conspiracy plot. Nash grows more and more paranoid until a discovery that turns his entire world upside down. Now, it's only with Alicia's help that he will be able to recover his mental strength and regain his status as the great mathematician we know him as today. Whew, that was a mouthful. Let's go ahead and jump into today's show. Dim the lights, raise the curtain, and start the previews. Welcome to the theater. Josh, welcome to the theater. I'm so excited to have you on.
Man, I'm excited to be here, man. It's exciting.
Yeah. I was trying to think this morning of when we met. I think it was 2008.
Yeah, I was halfway through my internship at church with the high school ministry, and our mutual friend, Allison Hibbard, introduced us and said, "Oh man, you guys are just like each other. You'll really hit it off." And I think we both instantly were offended by that suggestion.
My favorite part is I'm pretty sure that she told me, I don't know if she told you this, but you guys are so much alike that you're either going to be best friends or arch enemies. And I
think I disagree on all counts. I'm like, we're kind of alike, not that much. And
that's true, yeah.
And we are neither best friends nor arch enemies. We are good friends.
Yeah, well, I actually thought at the time, I've never had an arch enemy. That sounds fun.
I don't know. I think baggage comes with that, maybe. I don't really know
probably
for
right.
sure. Yeah.
You're probably right. But I was living in San Diego at the time.
Yeah.
Had been at in Orange County myself, but was down there then and then coming up. And at one point, you and I started writing movie reviews together, which was, I'm sure on the ones that you wrote were great.
No.
The ones that I wrote were terrible.
I mean, my biggest regret about that time, I'm sure what I wrote was terrible. I mean, are we going to talk about what the name of that thing was, or are we just going to pretend like that never happened?
I want to say this, that I said at the time, this is a bad name.
Yeah. Yeah.
And everybody said, no, you're wrong. It's great.
Not everybody, just the people making the decisions. All of our other friends mocked us. To this day, honestly, still to this day. If I told a certain group of people I was doing a podcast with you, the very first thing they would say is like, "Oh, are you calling it Treese's Peases?"
Yeah.
That was what
Yeah.
the name of that thing was.
It sure was.
My last
And
name is Josh Pease. My last name, my full name is Josh Pease. Pease, Treese. It was someone's brilliant idea.
Here's another thing, and I'm sure that Allison did not go this deep when she was talking to us. Your name is Josh Pease.
Yes.
My name is Josh Treese.
Correct.
Your middle name is David.
Mm-hmm.
My middle name, up until the time that my dad was going to sign my birth certificate, was going to be David.
Whoa.
And he changed it at the last minute.
Yeah, Allison probably wasn't factoring all that in.
I don't know. Is it your older son or your younger son's name is Caleb?
Older. Caleb
My
Joshua.
brother's name is Caleb.
Wow.
So there's all kinds of...
So this is less of a arch enemy situation and more of a multiple dimension, multiverse scenario where it's like two roads diverged and one of them became Josh Treese and one of them became Josh Pease, and somehow we ended up in the same timeline.
Is one of us the darker timeline? Do you currently have a black goatee?
Oh, I thought we were going to go. I thought we were going to go the direction of let's talk about whose life is sadder, and we'll determine it that way.
Oh no, I was thinking like in Community or maybe even Star Trek, where
I have a beard, and it's brownish. Definitely not a
Same.
goatee.
I have a beard, but mine's red. This is spooky. This is
The
spooky.
similarities are endless.
Yeah. So we met back then.
Yeah.
And one of the if not the main reason why I wanted to have you on was because, and I've told this story on the show before, but I've never told it to the other person who is involved in it, is that you have a very significant place in my story.
Wow.
In me leaving, I don't want to say leaving, but in my changing careers from ministry to mental health. And that is sometime during 2008, you and I and 3 other guys got together in like a small group type format, and we were reading a book and meeting like once a week and having discussions. And at some point after we had met for our small group, you and I were sitting in, I actually don't remember whose car it was. It might have been yours. But we were talking, and I do not recall what it is that you said leading up to this. And so when I tell the story, I usually say it like this. So Josh says, blah, 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 blah.
That sounds like
and
me.
And that's why I've been seeing a counselor for the last 2 months.
Wait, but you genuinely don't remember?
I don't.
So you have no idea what I said. It just led to you going to see a counselor?
Well, so after you said that,
Okay.
I said, wait, but you're not crazy.
Little did you know.
And you said, yeah, I know. and then you said,
amazing.
Well, what do you do when you have car trouble? Where do you take your car?
Oh wow.
And I said, well, you take it to a mechanic. And you said, why? And I said, well, because a mechanic is an expert in how cars work, and they can help you get your car working again. And you said, yeah. So a therapist or a counselor is somebody who is an expert at helping you process your emotions and your thoughts. And while they can't fix you, they can certainly help you get back to where you need to be. And so then the punchline to that, though, is that it impacted me so much that I waited 5 years before I went to see a therapist. But when the time came, like that conversation was ringing so loudly in my head and in my heart because, and I'll tell you why. It was because at that time, and still to this day, I just had so much admiration and respect for you. Like I told my wife, Josh was a guy who did all of the things that I liked to do and was grade A+ incredible at all of them. He was funny, he was wise, he could write, he could play. Everything that I thought, these are the things that make up me, seemed to also make up you, but you were so great at them. And so for me, it was somebody that I respected, somebody that I admired to be, I guess, showing the humility to realize, I've got limitations and I need some help beyond what I can do for myself, and I'm going to go get that help. And I don't think I could have conceptualized it that way in the car that night, but years later, looking back, that was such a, I guess, normalizing conversation for me in engaging with my own mental health, that when the time came to ask for help myself, I just remembered that you did it.
Wow.
And if you could do it, I could do it.
Jeez, man. That's a really nice story. Thank you. Oh gosh. It's so funny hearing you say all that, because there's two things that struck me. The first is, they're actually kind of connected. The first is, I'm so glad to hear a story of something I said or did that was a benefit to someone back then. Because I look back at my life back then and I'm just like, oh man, there's so many things I feel differently about, so many things that I hope I didn't mess people up along the way. And then the second thing is, like, just even how you're describing me during that time, because I was such an insecure wreck, especially during my internship at and so the fact that I was even being perceived as someone who's like, hey, this guy seems to have a thing or two figured out, I'm like, oh cool, because I internally was just terrified that I felt like I had no place in the world that I was in at that time. And so just even hearing that during all of that God was using some of the things I did, that's really cool, man. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
It's very humbling.
Yeah. Now, I have found over the course of my personal life since, and my professional clinical life, that we're all just doing our best, and inside we're all just, I guess, stumbling in the dark looking for a light switch.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're all like terrified kids, like we're all just scared kids. I mean, maybe not. Maybe I'm just projecting my stuff onto other people, but it just seems like the more I get to know people, the more I'm like, oh yeah, we're all scared. We're all scared that eventually people are going to find out kind of who we really are, see the real us or whatever, which gets into the movie, but we don't have to talk about that.
Yeah. So typically, like, I'll start each conversation by asking my guests why therapy, but you are the second guest that I've had on the show, the first being Nate Larkin, who isn't a therapist. You're not a counselor.
I am not.
So what exactly is it that you do right now?
I don't know. I don't know. I do my life's weird right now. I do a lot of things. So I would say that my life, in terms of what pays the bills, is split up into 3 different sections. I am currently employed 25 hours a week working at a church just south of Denver. I do that for lack of a better, I made up my title because I got tired of spending 20 minutes trying to explain to people what I do. So we're calling it communications and staff development. And so I do that for this church in an area called Centennial. And then I am also a freelance writer. If I really want to feel fancy, I'd call myself a freelance journalist. And then and this immediately undercuts the fancy, is I wait tables twice a night at a restaurant in the town where I live.
Twice a night?
Or shoot, twice a week. Twice a night.
I was going to say, if you're only doing 2 tables a night, then
yeah, I only wait on 2 tables.
An incredibly fancy restaurant.
I'm a very select server, like
one that's not very busy. I think that the writing is something that is extremely interesting to me, mainly because you've written for some pretty big publications. Relevant magazine, that's one. Also, I'm trying to think of the one at the top of your Twitter bio. Is it the Washington Post?
It is, yeah.
That's a pretty big fish.
Yeah, it's still weird to me. I was in DC a couple months ago for something completely unrelated to anything I've ever written, but my one contact that I have at the Post, I just randomly emailed. It's like, hey, I'd love to meet. And I assumed that he'd kind of blow me off because he's important, and he
was it Jeff Bezos?
It was not. Yep, it was Jeff Bezos. He's very involved in the day-to-day at the Post.
He's trying to get a rocket into space. So.
Sure, aren't we all? And I don't even know what that means. And
literally, he's trying to form his own space.
Oh, no. I don't know what mine meant about aren't we all. I don't know. It sounded profound. And so
there's a metaphor there, probably.
What you said was not a metaphor. It's literally a thing that man is trying to do. So he anyway, I met with this guy, and I'm sitting there in like the offices of the Washington Post looking around at me and like, I do not belong here. eventually they're going to realize like this person's an intruder and should not be here. It's weird. It's weird to me that I ever wrote for the Post, to be honest with you. It came kind of out of nowhere. I was, oh man, where do I start this story? For reasons that we can at some point in time, I'm glad to get into, I started writing about sexual abuse in the evangelical church, which makes me really fun at parties. And when they ask what you do, and I tell them that, and there's like, oh, like, yeah. And then it just gets silent. I had written an article about me realizing that there was probably a systemic problem that no one was really talking about. And this was before a lot of,
I was going to say, when was this? Yeah.
So it was before really any of that stuff, like about the Southern Baptist Convention or about really anything in evangelicalism had really been mainstream. People had been writing about it, but it had always been in smaller publications. It had never really caught on. And it was always like, oh, well, this one organization or this little sector over here has a problem. And my article was basically saying there's almost no research out there, but what little there is indicates there's a pandemic. And the publication that I was trying to write for saw the article. I was like, yeah, no, thank you. It was a Christian publication. And they were not interested in stirring the pot. And so I started kicking it around. And this is a true story. A fashion reporter for the Washington Post saw something I had posted on Facebook about how I would never wear matching pajamas, wanted to interview me for a story. And I said, I will let you interview me if in exchange you give me a contact that I could send this article to. And so she gave me a name, and it took about 6 to 9 months of hard work to dial it in and make it Washington Post level quality. But
I think the most unbelievable part of that story is that a fashion reporter
yes
contacted you
because of a post on Facebook about how much I hate matching pajamas, like families that take matching pajama photos. It's bizarre, man. And so out of that, I ended up for a period of time becoming this advocate for basically more accountability in evangelical settings on the topic of sexual abuse. And so I wrote after that Post article, I wrote for the New Republic, Christianity Today, Relevant Magazine. And that's not something I do as much now. Basically what's happened is papers that have dedicated reporters are picking it up and doing the very necessary hard work now of outlining what's happening in communities and in denominations and all of that. But yeah, man, it's a weird part of my story. I didn't go looking for it. But yeah, now if you look at my Twitter bio, it's got all this impressive stuff on it, and I don't really know how it got there. It's weird.
Well, I think it's from hard work, clearly.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of hard work. There was also again, there's just very much a divine, God, to be honest with you, I don't know how, spiritually leaning this podcast gets sometimes or not. But for me, gosh, this is going to get weird. Let's get weird, Josh. Okay.
Let's get weird.
Let's do it. I had before I moved from LA to Colorado, where I'm at now, I had these people praying over me, and they basically said, I think God is going to open up. I see you like almost doing like journalistic work and exposing the things that are out there or something weird like that. And I completely forgot about it. Did not go pursuing that line at all. Just kind of sat there, and they happened to make a recording of that. And I went back and listened to it. And that's when I remembered after some of this stuff had happened. And I realized honestly, I don't like to be like over spiritualized things guy, but it's hard for me to look at it and not say, oh yeah, God gave me the opportunity to be a voice at a really important time for survivors who didn't have that voice. And it got to redeem some of my story. This is something I didn't really understand until years after we were hanging out, but I about 4 or 5 years ago had to process sexual abuse in my own life that I'd never had a word for it. I never knew that's really what it was. And it's kind of this one weird outlier memory. And I had to realize that was a part of my story and that had really messed up my life in some significant ways.
Wow.
And so even getting to speak about that stuff, write about that stuff, and there's something redemptive about that. Of man, I'm
Yeah.
glad my pain, my story is getting to be used to the benefit of others. That's probably my favorite part about this whole Jesus Christianity thing for me, is that it's not that all things are good, but all things get work together for good.
Yeah.
Love it.
I think I have a friend, Todd. He's been on the show before, who's also a expert at recovery and addiction, and is also a pastor. And Todd says, God doing for me what I couldn't do for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's because I come from a Christian worldview as well. And even though the podcast is about mental health and relationships,
Totally.
It's also a place where I want to invite every person that's on it to just be their authentic self. And so for me, because, that's the worldview that I'm coming from, I can look back at that and I can say, hey, what I couldn't do for me, God did for me. And it sounds like that's a part of your story as well.
Yeah. I mean, sure. And I mean, the bummer is, and I'm intimately acquainted with how Christianity, or at least some strains of Christianity, have badly screwed this up. I mean, I spent 2 years of my life actively listening. There would be weeks where I would have 10, 15 interviews with people who had experienced some form of sexual, emotional, or physical abuse through the hands of a church or religiously motivated organization. And it's like, so I'm I'm pretty unblinking in my criticism of the current state of evangelicalism.
When systemic abuse has happened, as well as abuse that is more personal, but that was perpetrated in the context of a system that has kind of built itself to allow such a thing. That it occurs because one person is, I'm going to use the word, dehumanizing the other. Certainly not holding them up with the value that you were just speaking of.
Right.
I was reading something not too long ago. I think it was Brene Brown's Braving the Wilderness, where she talked about when you see public figures, and I'm not going to invoke any names here, but when you see public figures engaging in putting down large groups of people with sweeping, vague criticisms.
It's important that you don't name anyone here, though.
Yeah, I don't want to get. Listen, I'm okay with getting personal and talking about worldviews, but I don't want to get political.
Of course.
But it's in an effort to take actions that they could never take against another person. So, like, if I look a person in the eyes and I say, you're wrong, you're less than, you are, the very nature of who you are is not as valuable as the very nature of who I am. At best, that person may invoke a healthy boundary and walk away from me. At worst, they're going to physically fight me. And really, I guess that best and worst you could switch around depending upon what's going on. But to make these sweeping, generalized statements, it's a way of making a person into an idea. And people are much more comfortable disparaging and abusing ideas than they are doing that to another individual. And when we have these like religious systems which invoke a power dynamic to allow for this abuse, I think it's something that has gone unchecked for far too long. And I am very glad that courageous people like you are stepping forward and calling a spade and pointing it out and saying, we need to shine a light over here because people that these systems were designed and that self-stated that they would protect are being abused by the very systems that they're under.
I mean, that's it. it's honestly infuriating. Like, I don't the people that infuriate me most are the people who would consider themselves Christians and don't feel a call to that. Like, it's like I'm motivated not by an external look at a church that I'm like, oh, that, that church over there is so messed up. No, I'm like, as a follower of Jesus myself, it's like, how can we not be for the marginalized, for the oppressed, for the powerless, for all the people that the Bible clearly and unapologetically says that God is for, first and foremost. And it's like, we've got to do a better job of that, and anyway, yeah, that's just that's been a big part of my story for a few years now, is just and I find myself more and more moving toward that, not just with abuse, but just in general of trying to be an advocate for the marginalized, for the ignored, for the people who are treated as lesser than. And I think you're right that in certain church cultures and systems, we've gotten very comfortable with demonizing certain groups of people or thinking less of them, and in subtle ways, sometimes in ways that we don't even know that we're doing. But I mean, it's hard to look at the message of Jesus and specifically how he talked about the Samaritans, who were the hated, heretical, other in that time period, and how he held them up in his stories as being the heroes. I mean, it was infuriating. It was provocative. And it's like, we've lost that missional statement as a church, where it's like, we should be making other people mad by how insistent we are in defending the other. And unfortunately, in a lot of cultures, it's become the exact opposite.
Yeah. I also want to mention that you haven't just written for other people's publications, but that you yourself, several years ago, many years ago at this point, published a book.
I did. That's right.
The God Who Wasn't There.
I sometimes forget.
Looking for a savior in the middle of a pain.
Yeah.
So, I would be comfortable saying that you are what you said is a part of your church title, a communicator.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things that I've always enjoyed the most about knowing you and being your friend is you're somebody who, and I will say this, and I don't want to say this to flatter you, but I want to say it to be honest. You're somebody that can take a difficult to understand concept, be it abstract or concrete, and you can explain it to anyone in a way that they can understand and apply to their life. And that's something that I would say is the mark of a genius. And I like I said, I'm not trying to flatter you at all.
No, I appreciate it. It's very kind. Also, I have emotional intimacy issues, and I feel very uncomfortable right now.
That's all right.
Yeah, it is all right. It's very kind of you. Thank you.
It's something that I've had to work on in my own life, is being able to
be complimented.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like when I told you over text that you're a good interviewer, and you immediately told me, it's like, well, I'm learning. I have a long way to go.
That is a great example. Yes. I think, well, to be honest, I think the first thing I said was thanks.
You probably did.
I'm still learning. Yeah.
You probably did.
One of the reasons why I'm a little bit scared of that compliment is because, and I think that you and I are the same in this regard, which could make this episode very long. So neither one of us is short-winded.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
And so we are textbook examples of people who, instead of choosing one word that will work, we're going to add a couple of zeros.
What are we, utilitarian? What are we, Germans, where we have one word that says like a bunch? No, it's like we have to communicate with art and passion, right? That's what the people want.
Yes. Yeah. I'm trying to build a story using visual communication here. I want you to be able to see the scene that I'm describing.
I feel like I'm on a...
Rather than
your ability,
just being Kevin Malone.
Your ability to throw the pitch of your voice while saying that was unbelievable.
I tried.
Yeah, got a gift.
So let's talk about a movie.
Let's talk about a movie.
What movie did you bring for us to talk about today?
I chose the movie A Beautiful Mind, starring Russell Crowe, Jennifer Connelly, Ed Harris, Paul Bettany, a plethora of fine actors.
It's true. Christopher Plummer.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Didn't remember that.
I didn't either. Actually, I forgot.
This is exciting too, because I don't know if I've had another person on the show that's as much of a movie nerd as I am. So, I feel like we're gonna be able to go places we haven't gone before. Here's something I was shocked
Take
by.
that,
This movie
other
came out in
guests,
2000.
other places.
This movie came out in 2001.
Yeah.
I did not remember that.
Huh. Yeah.
This came out when I was still in my undergrad,
Yeah.
which is a long time ago.
Yeah, me too. How old are you? Am I allowed to ask that?
Oh, you are. I just turned 39.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, at the end of October.
So we're basically the same age. I'm 38, turning 39 in March. So yeah, same. I actually have a vivid memory of when I first saw this. I can remember who I saw it with. I can remember conversations that came out of it. Yeah, man, it made an impact on me at the time. And what's funny is I'll be interested to hear what it was like for you going back and watching it. I actually, oh man, I was conflicted because I am kind of a movie snob, because that is the world that I kind of traffic in, at least some. Part of me felt like such a schlub for picking this movie. It's like I should pick something that is like just that brings like a depth of excellence to it as a cinematic feat. And like honestly, man, this one's pretty like boilerplate Hollywood system Oscar bait. Like it's, and yet, man, this movie had an impact on me.
I think if you really wanted to go with one of the Fast and the Furious movies, I'd definitely let you.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about family, you know?
That's true. And Corona.
And holding the Corona in a really awkward way. I don't know if you've ever noticed that.
That's very true.
I don't think Vin Diesel has ever actually drank a beer from a bottle before, based on how he holds it in that movie. Anyway.
Huh.
Yeah, go back and watch.
Well, he does look like a turtle. So that's...
And if you imagine a turtle drinking a beer, it would be logistically awkward. So
boom. There you go. The Oscar bait thing is interesting because I went back and I looked at some of the contenders for that year. So like it got 4 Oscars. Yes. Jennifer Connelly, Best Supporting Actress, Best Picture, I think.
Did it win Best Picture? Goodness.
I think so. Brian Grazer got one, so I'm assuming it was for that. Best Director, Ron Howard, and then there was something else in there like cinematography or sound direction or something like that.
Was Crow not nominated? I thought he was.
He was nominated, but he didn't win.
Okay. Yeah, because he won for Gladiator. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So I just went and looked at the contenders for Best Picture and the contenders for Best Supporting, and there wasn't really a lot going on that year. And other than
Zoolander.
Lord of the Rings, boom. Other than Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring, like the other pictures that were in the acting category, at least, were ones that I don't think that I remember coming out, and I certainly remember this one.
Oh yeah.
And I think I remember seeing this movie at the time, although I don't have as clear a memory of it as you do, and I remember loving it. For a few different reasons. One is, the cast is just across the board, like A-list. Yeah. 2, Ron Howard, typically his movies are, they have a style.
They do.
I couldn't describe that style for you, but they have a style. They are typically very well received and very popular, although I don't know if his movies really say that much. As opposed to like if you look at other directors.
See, I would, and even with this movie, I would argue the things I take away from it, I think were completely unintentional. I don't think anyone really, I mean, there's just stuff, and even the timing when it hit me, and we'll get into all this, but like, I don't think what makes this movie like literally one of the life-changing films that I've seen is not because of anything that was intended. They stumbled. I think the movie stumbles on some incredibly powerful ideas. But yeah, I don't think Ron Howard in general necessarily has a ton to say, which, I mean, that's fine. It tends to be kind of inspirational, heartwarming stuff. He did the boxing movie with Russell Crowe.
Cinderella Man. See, that's, oh yeah. I had a poster of that up in my office in San Diego for a while. I loved that movie.
I've only seen it
mainly because with that movie, there was a line in it that stuck with me. And it's when it was like at a press conference or something, pre one of the fights. And he said, now I know what I'm fighting for. And that line in particular stuck with me in that. This movie, I had a really different experience watching it this time than I did the first time. It's not one that I've seen a ton in between.
Okay.
So I can't say that I've seen it, more than maybe a handful of times.
Sure.
But the first time that I saw it, A-list cast, Ron Howard, I'm trying to think of what I even knew going into it. I'm not sure I knew much going into it.
I didn't know anything.
But I definitely, walked out of it going, okay, good movie, good movie. This time watching it, I walked away feeling just sad.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Tremendously sad, which, I mean, I can unpack a little bit more later, but mainly because you just see the de-evolution of his character throughout the film.
Yeah.
And I would say almost in a way that was unchecked. Like there wasn't really, for most of the movie, anybody who was stepping in to try to help.
No. This is a bad movie, I think. And feel free to correct me. You're the person this is your career, not me. As a layman, I would never ever ever recommend this movie as like here's a great movie in terms of mental health and how to deal with it well. Like it is, as a matter of fact, I think maybe potentially if you read it the wrong way would be horribly damaging to some people and they should never ever watch it. Its take on schizophrenia and specifically how John Nash basically just, pulls himself up by his bootstraps to like fix it or whatever. Oh gosh, I don't think it works that way.
There was electroshock therapy.
Yeah, but like even that, like it seems like he just sort of. I mean, do we want to move chronologically through the plot here, or do you want me to like jump into it?
Well, let's start with this.
Okay.
Are there any scenes or themes that stick out with you? And I'll speak to what you just said, as we go through. Because I would disagree with you. I think this would be a good movie to show people as a way of engaging. And it's why when you suggested it, I said, yeah, let's do that one. But like most things, so like my guess is, even though I'm not intimately familiar with how you parent your boys, my guess is that you would never let your boys watch something without speaking into it yourself, without helping them to understand something. And I would say that this is something to where I would show it to people, but I would also try to speak into it as well to point out.
Okay. I'll be interested.
But as far as like turning somebody loose on it and saying, all right, derive from this what you will.
Well, it's more of like, there's that idea. I mean, and you could talk about it with therapy. You could talk about it with antidepressants. You could talk about it with literally anything in the mental health field. There is kind of this, well, sure, if you need medicine for that or if you need whatever for that, that's whatever. But like, I'm just going to like willpower my way through it. And I kind of feel like the movie, it's not trying to condone that exactly, but by John Nash being the only person that we see, it kind of feels like ultimately he just kind of has this epiphany about his condition and realizes like, oh, I can just choose to think differently because I'm a brilliant person. Yeah. And I'm like, well, I would never want anyone to feel like that is the message here. Like it would be very concerning to me to be like, that's not why I think this movie is particularly resonant in my life anyway. But again, I mean, I that's just me as a layman having like set up a couple of flags this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So tell me what about the movie stands out to you? Tell me about how it is that it affected you.
I remember I was watching this movie with my friend Brett and Christian and Megan. We were all political science majors in college. We spent a decent amount of time together. We were in a lot of the same classes together, and we went and saw this movie together. And I remember afterwards, Brett and myself both having this very intense like moment in watching this film. And I think the best way to kind of describe where I was at that time was I had grown up in I had grown up in an environment that was well-meaning and well-intentioned, but largely made me feel as though the very fact that there were things that I dealt with, the very fact that I had this like very strong and active sexuality that I didn't know what to do with, the very fact that I was this extremely emotional person who was prone to operating out of those emotions, like all this stuff, I felt like I was always a bad rule follower, I guess. I felt like I was never going to be the good kid. I wanted to be the good kid. I like the idea of being the good kid, but there's just these other people around me who seem to be so much better at following all the rules. And I specifically mean that in terms from like a religious point of view, as kind of like a good Christian or whatever, but even academically, stuff like that. There was always these people who just seemed to be able to like will themselves to being good or getting the best grades or whatever. And I always felt like, man, I feel like there's this part of me that is not able to be like that. That's kind of broken. There's this, I don't have that willpower. I don't have that ability to just kind of be the right person, be the good rule follower. And there was a sense, very much strongly, this sense of like, of projecting that onto God, of like, God is, I mean, yeah, Jesus died, this man, very evangelical Bible belt here, but like the mindset I took from my upbringing was God loves you unconditionally. He sent his son Jesus to die for your sins. And because if you accept that, you get to go to heaven. But are you really going to do a bunch of bad things when Jesus died for you? Is that really the kind of person you want to be? It's like, don't you think that kind of like makes God a little annoyed or frustrated or pissed off that you would like treat his act of love to you so cheaply? And
Did you ever get the is this really what you want to be doing when Jesus comes back?
oh, I mean, if not that exact phrase, that mentality was in everything. It was, Jesus died for your sins, so now we'll try real hard to be good. And I was bad at being good. I was bad at following all the rules.
If that is not the title of your next book, I'm going to be really disappointed.
What, I was bad at being good?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but like, and so that was most of high school, was me feeling like a delinquent Christian of like, woe is me, why can't I be better than this? And toward the tail end of college, I had man, both the movie we're talking about and the book I'm about to reference, I have very ambivalent feelings about now. But I was reading this book called Waking the Dead by John Eldridge, which now today, just insert like 30 seconds of disclaimer in here. Like you can snip it in later. But one of the things that book, I can't completely be critical of it, because one of the things that book did for me was it introduced me to this idea that there are these lies we believe about ourselves, and we believe that God believes them. So it's like basically the theme of the book is there are two lies that we all believe, either that God is holding out on us or that we're letting him down. And that we carry those lies into everything that we're doing and being. And basically the theme of the book was like, what if you didn't believe those lies? What if you believed that you were good, that you were created good, that you were loved by God unconditionally, that there's nothing that goodness, that grace toward you flows every single day of your life. There's nothing you can do to increase it or decrease it. It's just there. It's this constant river of good flowing toward you. And the question is just, are you going to like let yourself be swept away by that? Not, are you going to earn it? But anyway, and so I'm reading this, and for the first time, it's like all of a sudden this light bulb's going on where I'm seeing all these lies I believe about myself, of like believing that, I'm not lovable enough, I'm not likable enough, that I'm not whatever. And I started realizing like, man, it would be so freeing to not believe those lies. Like imagine a world where those things, those impressions I have of myself, what if those weren't there? What would I feel like toward God? What would I feel like toward the people around me? And being like, oh my gosh, that would be the most freeing thing I can imagine. So not only do I start realizing that for me, I start realizing early on in college, like I kind of have this like ability, and this is still a big part of my story. I think I can pretty quickly see the lies other people are believing about themselves. And I can imagine the kind of person they would be if they didn't believe those lies. And so in that sense, I do have kind of a little bit of that therapist bug. I just don't have the training for it, but like that same part of me that's just like, oh man, how freeing would it be if you didn't believe this about yourself? The problem is therapists are really patient about letting people figure that out for themselves. And I just want to tell people immediately.
Well, here's a behind the curtain peek.
Yeah.
Is a therapist want to just tell them, but
Yeah.
if you just tell somebody, then is it helping them?
Turns out your way's probably better. Yeah.
Well, it's not my way. First off,
Oh, I've been
I
calling
was
it. I've been
trained. I
calling
was
it the
given
Josh
that.
Treese method.
The
So yeah.
method, yeah. I mean, but it's kind of one of these where I told a client the other day, because they asked me what I thought about something, and I said, I don't want to be like a snarky, stereotypical therapist and just respond with, well, what do you think? Because I want to honor that you're asking me a question. I said, so let me do this. Instead of just telling you an outright answer, let me tell you a story, which is pretty typical Josh Treese method right there. But I don't want a client to become a carbon copy of me,
Totally.
because the whole job of therapy is to help a person find what's inside of them. So if I just give an answer, it's coming from my perspective and it's just giving them my answer. I want to help them find their answer.
Totally.
And sometimes their answer is miles different than what my answer would have been. And so I'm doing them a disservice if I give them mine, because what if they accept that? And what if they run with that and they just become me?
Oh man, it's actually kind of convicting. Yeah. No, hearing you say that, I'm like there's a humility there that I think I need to grow a lot in, of realizing just because I have a inclination towards some things doesn't mean I have this infallible gift. Even the way I described it's probably a little problematic. That's good. I feel like I've grown in the first 49 minutes. I feel like I've grown as a person. You truly are a good therapist. So this is all this stuff is just percolating and it's like transforming. It really is. I mean, this was the epiphany moment that went from me being a journalism political science major who was going to move to Washington, D.C. and be in the political world. That was my life. That was the goal. And all of a sudden I'm like talking to these people around me and being like, hey, what if you didn't believe this stuff about yourself? What if you believe what God believes about you instead? Like, wouldn't that be better? And they're like, yeah, that would be better. I was like, I feel like maybe you believe this thing about yourself. They're like, yeah, I think I do. I was like, well, God doesn't. What if you just like, didn't do that? Yeah, I'm sure I said it better than that. But as that's happening, I go see this movie, A Beautiful Mind. And there are two scenes that are indelibly burned into my memory. The first one is the scene probably 2/3 of the way through the movie, maybe, where John Nash, played by Russell Crowe, and Ed Harris are screaming at each other on the front lawn at this university. And then there's another scene at the very, very end of the movie. But both of them are kind of spoilery. So if you want to like start at the beginning of the movie, you can. But like basically the whole premise of this film is that there's this brilliant mathematician guy, right, named John Nash. But what he does not realize, and what you as a viewer don't realize from most of the movie, is that he is schizophrenic, and that there's three different characters. Paul Bettany's character, who's like his college dorm room friend who accepts him when he feels like he doesn't really have a place. And then Paul Bettany's niece, who shows up later on. And then Ed Harris's character, who's this shadowy government agent in this Soviet, conspiracy Cold War era.
The first time John Nash's character sees him, he says, "What's with Big Brother?"
100%. Yeah. Totally. And what you find out later is all three of these characters are figments of his imagination. And you didn't, and I mean, maybe some people figured it out. The first time I saw this movie, I absolutely did not. And what you realize is that all of these characters play a role in sort of John's understanding of himself, and they provide a sense of comfort to him because of what they tell him about himself. And specifically, Ed Harris's character is telling him, you're important because you are doing something great. You are fighting the communists. You're a patriot. You're helping your country. You are involved in this big, giant story. And you play an important role in that. And because of that, that's what makes you valuable. That's what makes you important. And when Nash, after going through, electroshock treatment and all this stuff, eventually decides like, okay, I get it now. I get these people aren't real. I'm just going to sort of will myself to recognizing that they're not real. Ed Harris's character is screaming at him saying, "You're pathetic. You're a schlub. You can't even," he had in that scene, like the student who didn't know who he was wouldn't let him into the library, and Ed Harris is showing up, and it's like, you're just going to be this slobbering, mess of a person who dies having never done anything big, never done anything important. And John Nash is just like holding his, like smoking a cigarette and trembling and walking around in circles while all these people are staring at him, talking to an imaginary friend, a delusion. And he's just saying, "You're not real. You're not real. You're not real." And Ed Harris's line back to him is, "You're still talking to me, soldier."
Mm-hmm.
And oh my gosh, even describing that scene now, it gives me chills. Because holy crap, who can't identify with that? Who can't identify with this voice that's in your life that tells you you're never going to be good enough, you're never going to be strong enough, you're never going to be smart enough, you're never going to be lovable enough, you're never going to achieve the things that make you important, you're never going to find the love that'll make you feel okay. I mean, how many of us haven't felt that? And even some of us, myself, it's like, I know intellectually those voices aren't real, they're not correct, they're not true, and yet I'm still talking to them, and sometimes it feels like they're screaming at me.
Yeah, let me go into the multiverse for
Please.
a sec. I just can't help but think about the line that Dumbledore says to Harry in King's Cross Station towards the end of the story.
Yeah.
Just because it's happening in your head doesn't mean that it's not real. Because there's a few kind of psychological, I guess, things that are happening in the scene you just described. So there's a therapist is going to practice from a worldview that they have. The therapy term for worldview is called a modality.
Okay.
And a modality you could look at as a school of thought in therapy. So there's a modality called internal family systems. The best display of which is the movie Inside Out.
Love that movie.
That's the best display of IFS that there is. And the easiest way to kind of describe IFS to somebody is if you were to recall having ever said, "Well, part of me thinks this, but another part of me thinks that." That's IFS. So it seems to me like the way that you're describing that each of these characters that are inside of Nash's head, they serve a purpose. So each of them are a part of him, at least in kind of the narrative way of moving the story along. So they exist in a system. Now, the system is an intrapersonal system. It's all taking place inside of John Nash. But homeostasis is the method by which a system always tries to default back to its default mode. And whenever a piece of a system changes, and this could be in any system, so like a group of friends, a nuclear family, a family of origin, like a work team, whenever any piece of the system changes, it's going to have an effect on every other piece of the system. And so the system itself, through homeostasis, is going to try to not overcorrect, but it's going to try to correct itself to get things back to the status quo. So this Ed Harris character, who at one point in the story was saying, this is the way that you're going to find purpose, you're going to find meaning. So maybe he was his drive, maybe he was his ambition, maybe he was his resilience, whatever he was to him. All of a sudden, when John is now saying, "I don't need you anymore," then the system tries to correct itself, and now that character becomes an oppressive character that's fighting back.
I mean,
so it's just it's a system that's trying to correct itself.
Yeah, but I mean, that's like what addictions or whatever feel like, right? I mean, they're like, when the moment you start trying to fight against that stuff, it feels like it fights back. I mean, the way that that homeostasis you're talking about, the way that I at least have experienced that, the way I've noticed other people, it's like when you start leaning into it, it's like it fights back with a vengeance, because all of a sudden you're leaning into all that pain, that trauma, that whatever that you've been, repressing. It's like for the first time, it's like that existed for a reason. Like there's a reason why that was there, and to protect you from feeling something you didn't want to feel, or adapting or whatever. And when you start leaning into some of that stuff, it's like it's intense. And I think just what was so powerful to me about that moment was, and it's what Russell Crowe really, I mean, it's my favorite acting moment in that movie, because he feels crazy. Like he's like, in this moment, he's like, I know you're not real. And yet at the time right now, you're screaming at me, and this is all I can hear, all I can see. And I'm like, man, I identify with that. I get that feeling. It captured, I remember sitting in the theater watching that, and something in me like wanting to burst into tears in that moment, because I was like, I know what that feels like.
Yeah. Well, I think that I'm so glad that Dumbledore line came to mind, because I think that just because it's in your head, it doesn't mean that it's not real.
Yeah.
Just because that another person's not experiencing it with you at the same time, at least, doesn't mean that it's not significant and that it's not having an effect on you. And whether it be addiction or trauma or whatever, maybe something happened in the past that is either, bearing down on you in the present, or the ripples of that are having an effect on you in the present. If we were to just kind of look at, all right, is that real? Is that something currently happening? It's not, but it's real because it's in your life. It's real because it had an effect.
Yeah. So you talking about how just because you're the only one experiencing it doesn't make it not real. It's such I feel like it circles back around to so many conversations we've already had, even talking about like how the church deals with abuse. I think that's such a part of this, because what happens so often in those moments is a leader at a church will see the situation that has happened, where there's some sort of abuse that has happened, let's say between another congregant, between two congregants. And they'll say, okay, I see what's happened here. This person has done this wrong thing to this person. And so they'll put them in a room and say, you need to apologize to this person. You need to apologize for what you did. And what they don't realize, and what the survivor of that might not have the words to understand, it's like, no, you're just re-traumatizing them. You are exposing them again to something that's harmful to them. And when they try to say, I'm not ready to forgive this person, I don't want to be asked to do that, what I want is justice. What I want is help. What I want is help figuring out how to deal with this trauma I've been through. The response tends to be pushback of like, well, you just need to forgive and get over it and move on, as though that's like the right theological answer. And it's like, it's a failure to understand what all the Ed Harrises that are in our heads that are screaming at us are legitimate. And we need to acknowledge their legitimacy. We have to acknowledge their legitimacy if we are going to genuinely, and again, I keep bringing this back to church because that's just such my world. But if we are going to try to talk about like, God loves you, God loves everyone, you're God's kid, we sure as hell better do the work to help people understand how God as dad is different than their dad, how love is different than the love that they've experienced, how that abuse that they experienced in a church setting is different. That wasn't God's plan for their life. That wasn't good. That wasn't in his name. We have to recognize that these voices that are yelling inside my head, inside all of our heads, are legitimate. They're real. And you can't just suck it up and ignore them and move on, or like toss some sort of bumper sticker at them. It takes hard work, and it takes time, and it takes grace and compassion. And this movie, I feel like, accidentally taps into this very compassionate look of what it's like to deal with a dysfunctional childhood, or trauma, or mental illness, or whatever, as a very real thing that other people can't understand.
I think, speaking to the failures of the church to engage with trauma at worst, or conflict at best, I think that one failure that the church has had is engaging with emotion at all. And
Oh my
so
gosh,
I
yes.
think that in, reading the Bible and in the church's, let's go with desire to take it literally, I think that they have mistaken literal for word account. And
Mm.
so
Mm-hmm.
I think that one thing that, scripture does is it kind of gives a synopsis of what happened a lot of times. And so it doesn't oftentimes depict an emotional process in a
Mm-hmm.
story. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think that churches,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't want to generalize. So I think a lot of times,
Oh, I'm fine with generalizing, but I understand how you
there you
don't,
go.
but I
I
will
think a lot of
generalize
times
away.
people in the church, they want to skip to a resolution. They want to skip to the happy
Of
ending.
course. Of course.
But,
Of course. Yes.
forgiveness, though it may occur at a particular point in time as an event, is oftentimes a process that a person works up to. And then even though,
Yeah.
forgiveness may happen at a time and place that we can pinpoint, forgiveness is different than restoration of the relationship. It's different. It's different than
Oh,
saying,
absolutely. Yeah.
now I have full trust back in you. A lot of times it's
Yeah.
actually the
Well,
beginning
I
of
mean,
that process.
oh my God. Yeah. Yeah. You just covered a lot of ground there. There's like 18 things you just said that I'm like, yes, that. I mean, the first one that you said that I resonate deeply with is, I mean, I do think, I mean, what's interesting is if you look at sort of the Hebrew culture that most of the Bible was written for, and written by, there was a freedom in that culture to read emotion into the story. There was freedom to storytell. Like these stories were jumping off points, of like, this is sort of the framework of this story, but like make it come alive, lean into the empathy of these things. The Jewish culture and tradition has a rich heritage of that kind of storytelling. And I think I mean, depending on which day you catch me on will depend how cynical I am about this, but in a lot of ways, I think we have stripped, like, the fundamental concept of Christianity is relational. At its heart is this concept of there is a God who is pursuing relationship with humans, and his attempts to do that and humans' attempts to understand it. I would argue that is the entire narrative of all of Christianity. And we have turned something that's inherently narrative, inherently relational, inherently emotional, inherently this messy, hard to pin down. Because how can you really define relationship? You can't say, like, oh, you do these 8 things and you'll have a good marriage or you have a good friendship. That might be fine starts, but a good marriage and a good friendship is about the intangibles. It's about the emotional, the empathy of moving toward each other. It's all that stuff that can't really be defined. That's the good stuff. And yet when it comes to this relationship that we talk about between humans and God, we've stripped it so often of the mystery of the relationship, of all of that, and we've turned it into these bullet points, and then we expect people to abide by the bullet
I
points. But life
Yeah, and I
doesn't
think
work
that,
that
as
way.
you were talking, I had a couple of things run through me. The first being that, um, I don't want us to get to a place where we're kind of preaching in the conversation. But the second,
Oh,
this,
well, I
well,
am a
yeah, but I
preacher,
mean
but yeah, yeah.
the reason for
No,
that,
you're
though,
right.
the reason for that, and I think that this is what happens in churches so often is that we want to justify our actions by playing the God card, when the
Yeah.
truth of the matter is, while forgiveness is a process, while restoration of trust is a process, both of those processes are going to start by an individual taking responsibility for their part of the story. And I don't
Mm-hmm.
think that any truly authentic, vulnerable, or intimate relationship can happen if I'm not willing to fully show up and take
Mm-hmm.
responsibility for my part, and you're not willing to do the same. And I think that
Totally.
sometimes people want to
Yeah.
hide behind, an institution or a religion or a God
Mm.
in order to justify or to hide. And I don't think that can work when we get down to person-to-person relationships.
No, it can't, and it shouldn't. It was never meant to. I mean, maybe another thing that's like a work of fiction that had a pretty big influence on my life is there's this chapter from the book The Brothers Karamazov, where basically it's this one chapter is this long story that one of the brothers is sort of making up about this priest during the Spanish Inquisition, and he brings in Jesus, and Jesus is basically literally on trial or being questioned by this priest, and the priest is basically saying, you give people too much freedom. You give people, like, your way, it creates, you trust people too much. You give them too much space. You give them too much room to make decisions for themselves, to find you for themselves. We have improved your system. We have figured out a better way to do it. We will give people what they need. We'll give people what they want. We will explain to them what this is and what this looks like. And at the end of the story, Jesus leans over and kisses the priest on his cheek, and the priest starts crying, and Jesus leaves. And that's the end of the story. And I love, 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 love that idea that whatever this world that we're in, whoever this God is, like, if there's anything to this Christianity thing, that what he is doing is respecting our personhood and inviting us into a story, but never just telling us come and be abused by this system.
And I think that if we're going to bring that back to the movie, what we're seeing throughout the movie, certainly the story of John Nash kind of devolving, but because of his relationship with his wife Alicia, because of his relationship with some of his colleagues, one of which was somebody who was, I don't want to say abusive, but certainly picked on him when he was in school, is that they never see him as less of a person, that they never try to reduce him to the sum of his deficiencies. They never try to look at him as a diagnosis. They always look at him as a person that they love, and at the same time recognize this guy has problems. He's sick. But they don't separate those two things out.
Yeah, no, totally. And it's a beautifully well done arc. In real life, I would say the real John Nash was actually the story of his wife and her role, and the real John Nash's life is more powerful in the sense that she had far better boundaries. Poor Jennifer Connelly's character in this movie is she's kind of the patient wife who puts up with the brilliant man kind of shtick. But in real life, she left him and then ultimately let him come back and live with her. But it was like as a roommate with like clear, like, I mean, she was his like basically landlord in that situation. And she drew clear boundaries between her life and his. And it's really interesting because, like, you know, when you're dealing with like the narrative of the real John Nash's life is far more difficult, right? As it always is for all of us. Our stories are never this clean arc toward redemption. There's ups and downs and flaws and failures. And the real John Nash was a really unpleasant man, a really problematic guy in a lot of ways. And yet his wife continued to show mercy and grace toward him, even in the middle of all of that. And I find that, you know, the Enneagram 4 in me that longs for authenticity finds that even more beautiful. This idea that even though she didn't really like this guy by the end very much, she was still committed to his like his health and his wellness.
The Enneagram, and you're telling, I am surprised to hear that you're a 4.
Oh my goodness, why are you surprised? Yeah, most people do. Yeah, it's my common. That's what people commonly think of.
I mean, hearing you talk about, you know, college Josh especially being bad at following the rules, that definitely invokes a 4.
Yeah.
So I get that.
Yeah. It's like I'm a 4 who runs really hot with emotions, and I think that comes across as argumentative, which I am. But no, the core of what I want is for the authentic me to be known. And yeah, and the way that uniqueness expresses itself is through really strong opinions. And being a pain in the ass a lot of the time.
So one thing that I've said a lot on the show is relationally, health is attracted to health, unhealth is attracted to unhealth, or Water always
Yeah.
rises to meet its own level. And so, Hollywood would glamorize this relationship in the movie between John Nash and Alicia. But as I'm watching it, one of the things that I experienced differently this time was when they first meet, he is a professor,
Mm.
she is in his class. He is already clearly
Yep.
experiencing symptoms. And yet she
Mm-hmm.
is flirtatious with him. She asks him
Yep.
to go to dinner and she pursues him. And I can't
Yeah.
help but wonder what that says about her in the movie. I can't speak to the real people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my argument would probably be it says a lot more about the people who wrote the movie than it does that
Yeah.
actual
Yeah.
character. You know what I mean? I don't think that character, that's one of my biggest complaints about the movie is Jennifer Connelly's not a real person. She exists to enable the great man
Yeah.
to do his great things, which is, I mean, everything you just said is absolutely accurate and deeply problematic. Of like, he has a relationship with a student. No good, very bad. Don't do it. Like, I think we've learned that by now. There's a power dynamic there
Right.
that's not appropriate. And why does she pursue him? This gorgeous, confident woman pursues this guy who's really flawed and awkward and mean and unpleasant. And yet she sees the
nearly
good
everything
in him,
he
right?
says to her would make
Yeah.
a typical person run the other way. And
Yeah.
yet,
yeah. And it's meant to be like, look how great she is. I mean, she's like angelic. She's like the Madonna, right? Like the beatific one. And it's problematic. Like again, I have a very tense relationship with this movie because there's a lot of things about it I really don't like. It just got me at such a critical time in my story. And again, it was in a way that almost isn't about, I could dive into the text of this movie and the things that stand out to me are barely there. But they're still there. Like they accidentally stumbled on some really
and I think
profound
that
stuff.
I was thinking about it this morning. There are stories that come into our lives at certain points in our story, and for whatever reason, we connect with them at that time. And a lot of the times, it's because it enables us to put words or emotions to something that we weren't able to before. It gives us the language to process and engage with what's going on in our life. And while the story that we are coming into contact with may not actually be any good, especially the ones that we look back on and see now, at the time, it unlocked something in us. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this show using movies is because, it's a common framework that we all have, that we all engage with. And I don't need a good movie to engage in a truth about a relationship or a truth about mental health. All I need is a jumping off point. And I think that, even though we can look back at this movie that was made 18 years ago and we can see problems, clearly it had a role in your life. It served as an Ebenezer,
100%.
if nothing else, a marker.
much like I played a role in your life, despite being a very flawed and broken person. It's like I'm looking back at the time that you talk about, like where I had this impact on you, and I'm like, oh my god, I was such a mess. Like it's such a gift. What a gift it is that we can impact each other's lives while we're
and here's the thing
is
is
so much stuff.
Like that really was a seed because even though I said it in a joking way,
totally
5 years before I decided to ask for help in my own life. And one of the things that I say on the show, and I say it to all of my clients all the time is, we've all got a bad case of being a person. And it's terminal. We're going to die a person. There's no cure for it. And
we will.
And every single one of us is messed up. Every single one of us is glorious. Every single one of us has voices inside of ourselves that are speaking toxic shame to us, that are trying to isolate us, that are trying to keep us down. Every single one of us has the potential to find hope.
And that's, just as I'm thinking about how you're talking about this, that's why the end of this movie I mean, it still gets me. The very end of this movie, he's, not the part where like he wins the Nobel Prize. He's, Jennifer Connelly is still for some reason with him, and
Terrible
she's
old
still
person makeup, by the
beatific.
way. Terrible.
Terrible,
It's like
terrible
Party
old
City
person
Halloween
makeup.
mask quality.
100%. The end of this movie, someone like he's just won this major award. He's achieved the things in life that he wanted to achieve. He's an
He
important
found his one
person,
original
right?
idea.
And someone asks him, yeah, and someone asks him, and he's known for it. People have noticed him. They have told him, we see your good idea. You are a brilliant person. You matter. It's all the things he's ever wanted. And someone comes up to him and says, do you still see them? And what they're asking is like, do you still see these hallucinating figures in your life? These the three people, Ed Harris and Paul Bettany and this girl. And he looks over, and they're over against the wall on the side of this crowded room, and they're staring at him. And he says, yeah, I still see them, but I've learned to ignore them, and I think they've come to accept that, or something like that. And I remember for me, and it's still, even now, I love that image has burned itself, I mean, at a deep level into how I think and feel and process. There is grace to be in the struggle, to be in the journey. There's grace to have these lies that you believe about yourself that keep hanging on and keep nagging at you. There is grace for us to not be over the traumas of our past and to get still tripped up by the same addictions. There's grace for our failures. There's grace even when we should know better. There's grace. The goal is like at the end of our lives, as we go about our lives, how we learn more and more to say like, yeah, there's these traumas, there's these voices, there's these lies, there's these temptations, there's whatever word you want to use. But I've more or less learned to ignore them, and I think they've come to accept that. I mean, to me, that's what man, that redefined the win of my life for me. It wasn't, I need to be this good person for God so that he'll be pleased with me. And it turned into, am I on a journey toward living out of my true self more and more and more? And is that the arc of my life, that I'm moving more and more into living in the authentic version of who I am? And it's like, I so badly want that for me. I so badly want that for other people. Not that we're like perfect, not that we don't like still carry our wounds and our scars and our flaws, because of course we will. But that we're able to say, it's like, yeah, they're still there. And we even accept that they're still there.
So clinically, we call that integration. And one of the things that I love the most about the 12 steps of recovery is that it doesn't end with us denying what has gone on in the past. In fact, one of the results of it, because you've got the 12 steps, you've also got the 12 promises, one of the results of it is you can look back on your past without a feeling or a sense of shame. Because the way the 12 steps work, and the 12 steps, they're in the order that they're in for a reason, because they build on one another. So in other words, if you were just starting and you were to look at step 8 and 9, make a list of those that you've wronged and then seek to make amends. If you were to look at that at the beginning, you would go, there ain't no way I'm going to be able to do that. But when you work steps 1 through 7, what you find is standing on the precipice of 8, you go, all right, this is going to be tough, but I can do it. And what happens is when you get to step 12, which is take the message out into the world that those that are still in need, but you're able to do that and tell your own story because of what was given to you through your own story and through engaging your own story. I had a therapist tell me one time, oh, you don't know your own story. And I thought, who the hell are you?
Yeah.
You don't know.
Screw you, man. You're not my dad. Yeah. Oh, I heard it.
And then of course, as I continued to do my own work as a client, what I found was they were right. I really didn't know my own story. And so it was my job to become familiar with it, to engage in it as opposed to avoiding it, which I had done for so many years. And that's really what integration is. It's a re-engagement with your own story. And and becoming a part of it once again. It's like self-acceptance to
Yeah,
the nth degree.
totally. Have you, if I might bring in another piece of pop culture into this, have you seen the TV show Mr. Robot?
I haven't. It's on a list. I want to.
It's good. It's good. It's weird, and I'm not recommending people go out and watch it because it's a bizarre, crazy town show. But there is a moment. It is just 2 episodes back, where a character that you've spent 5 seasons with or whatever, for the first time has to see their life for what it really is, and they get angry. They're so mad because they're like, they don't want that to define them. They like this thing, and it's a trauma. It was systemic sexual abuse, and they all of a sudden they'd repress this for all their lives, and for the first time they're having to see it for what it is, and it's like such a violation in that moment for that person to like let that have to be a part of who they are. And I identify with that. I had to go through that process. It's like, it's not fair. You're like, I don't want this to be like part of me. Like it feels like being violated again to have to acknowledge that that's true. And yet when you start, and it's, oh my gosh, it's one of the best episodes of television. Wow. I wouldn't recommend necessarily people watch the whole show because it's so weird, but this one episode, and maybe it might even be able to stand on its own, I don't know, but it is one of the best episodes of television I've seen this decade probably. And it's one of the most powerful depictions I've ever seen of that idea of integration, of someone just beginning to accept the trauma into their story and let it be a part of who they are, but to acknowledge the fact that it doesn't mean Ed Harris is going to be screaming in your face for the rest of your life. Yeah. And that's something I have to keep coming back to as I deal with my past hurts and past traumas. It's like, sometimes they get a little bit louder. Sometimes, that stuff starts, I feel the emotional intensity of them getting cranked up, and I have to look at it again and see it for what it is and acknowledge that it's there, but then also put it in its place to be like, that is part of my story. But it's not it's not the entirety of who I am either. And for it to be that thing it's like, and that's why I love the end of A Beautiful Mind. It's there and I see it and I acknowledge it for what it is. But I also acknowledge the fact that it doesn't dictate my actions.
You're something more. Yeah. What's interesting though is to get there, you have to start by accepting that the thing happened. And I know that like in my work with people with addictions, one of the areas that I find they fight the most on at the beginning is just saying, hello, my name is so-and-so and I'm an addict. It's a label that, and especially if they are a part of the church, especially because, well, no, that's not me. I mean, isn't this covered by Jesus? Aren't I a follower of Jesus? Aren't I forgiven and stuff? Absolutely you are. But you've also been running from this and hiding from this and not acknowledging this forever. And so you gotta at some point show up to the party. You gotta at some point bring who you really are. And while this isn't all of you, this is an important part of you that you have to finally acknowledge.
Totally.
And that's where it starts.
And I mean, the beauty of therapy, the beauty of the message of Jesus when we get it right is saying, it's like, you don't have to be ashamed. Like, yes, that stuff sucks. And yes, even the way you've acted out of that stuff sucks, but it's not who you are. There's something more.
I would go a step further.
You're not defined.
And because I think this is one area where the church has got it wrong. I hear the principle behind what you're saying. You don't have to be ashamed, but I would go a step further and say, what is your shame telling you? 100%. Let's acknowledge that, because 2 weeks ago on the show, I had Dr. Chip Dodd, who wrote the book, The Voice of the Heart. And in there, he says that the message that shame is trying to give us is that we have limitations. That's the message of healthy shame. The message of toxic shame is that negative self-talk. But shame at its most healthy, shame that was actually given to us by God, is you have limitations. And if you can engage with that message, the gift of shame is humility that leads to relationship.
Wow. Okay.
And so
I'm gonna have to sit with that one.
And so like, let's say that, I'm able to engage with my healthy shame, feel my shame, and discover, hey, what is my limitation in this? So just the most banal banal example, I don't know how to pronounce that word, I'm trying to sound smart, that I can give is
Banal.
like, let's say that I've got a big test coming up and I'm not sure if I can pass it. So maybe my initial read on that is to not tell anybody and to show up and just roll the dice and see how it happens. But if I can listen to my healthy shame, it may say, okay, Josh, you have limitations, and that's that you aren't grasping this material. Now, notice that I'm not saying I can't grasp it, but I'm not grasping it. And so to engage in that message and maybe receive humility from that, in my humility to go to a classmate and say, hey, I'm not getting this. Can you help me? That's going to lead to relationship with that person. And I'm going to get something that I couldn't get outside a relationship.
So would you say that's shame that you're feeling in that moment? Or is it just more of a sense of like, because it feels like I would almost say the shame gets tacked on to a normal feeling, which is like, I am not capable of doing this. There's a scenario where that could be fine, right? Where you're like, yeah, that's fine. I'm not.
So in this case, like, we talked about modalities earlier. So Chip Dodd's spiritual root system, definitely a modality that I come from because of the effect that it had on me. So in that modality, I would call that shame. Because what you described, could you put a feeling to that? Like a feeling word? One of the...
I guess I would be saying, like, hopefully I would get to the point where I wouldn't even feel shame over that. I would just be like, yeah, there's some things I'm not very good. I mean, that would be the humility that you're talking about. Is like
which comes as a result of truly engaging the shame. Now,
and I guess what you're saying is no one starts there.
Right.
That's something you have to work toward.
And I'll say this too, like spiritual root system, voice of the heart, it is a framework. It's not the framework. It's not the only one. So like, one of the things that Leanne and I have had tons of discussions on is she comes from more of a place of Brene Brown, that there's no such thing as healthy shame, that healthy shame is really guilt. Whereas I'm coming from a place of saying, well, guilt is about what I've done. Shame is about who I am. And I think that there is such a thing as healthy shame. I think if I refuse to engage with it, then it becomes toxic shame. Then it becomes the shame is controlling me rather than me using the shame to get more information, because feelings are really just a way of us getting information about what's going on inside of ourselves. So like if I listen to and engage in with my feelings, they're not good, they're not bad, they just are. They're alarms that are going off that say, hey, something's happening inside of you that you need to pay attention to. And shame is one that's just saying you have limitations. And what it's really doing is it's highlighting a limitation that you have in the moment, or at least a limitation that's coming to the surface. And to engage in that is, the gift of that is humility. The impairment of that is toxic shame. And the impairment happens when we refuse to engage. Or can't engage, not refuse. Like it's maybe, in that moment we just can't. We don't have it inside of us because of our story, because of where we're at. I mean, for whatever reason.
Well, and that's part of. I mean, another to like take sort of this accidental metaphor that I think the movie is on too, is you have to see it for what it is. Like if you're convinced that thing is like, you have to see that it's like, oh, this is a real thing I'm experiencing. It is a valid thing I'm experiencing, but it is also not based in truth.
Yes.
It is not a healthy assessment of the world, of myself, of whatever. It's like, if you haven't reached that point, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
Like there has to first be an acknowledgement of like, oh, there's a scenario where I don't feel this way. There's a scenario where I'm not carrying this around. How do I get to that place? And what does it look like for me to have self-acceptance in the journey towards
Well, and I think that when I said, feelings aren't good, feelings aren't bad, feelings just are. So because of that, a feeling cannot be wrong. A feeling can't be wrong. A feeling can't be right. However, to quote Brene Brown, the story that I'm telling myself that this feeling is a result of, that can be right or wrong. So
100%.
Maybe I am constructing a narrative about what's happening and I'm feeling a way about it, but that's my construction. That doesn't mean it's reality. That doesn't mean it's life on life's terms.
The feeling makes sense based on that narrative,
Yes.
but the narrative is
And I think
incorrect.
that's,
Yeah.
whenever I say, we've all just got a bad case of being a person, part of that is everybody makes sense in the context of their own story.
100%.
And to take that down a level deeper, everybody makes sense in the context of the story that they're telling themselves. And it's not to say that every behavior is healthy or every behavior is right. That's just to say that every behavior makes sense if you have the full context.
Dude, there's actually, this is random, but a guy that you'll be familiar with, Andy Stanley. He's a pastor of this giant church in Atlanta. And he actually said something similar. He probably stole it from some psychology book he wrote. But he basically talked about, it was a talk, entirely a leadership talk aimed at church people. And it was about basically how the systems of your church organization will shape behaviors. But he used this example and it kind of blew my mind at the time. This is years ago. I was like, I've never heard anyone say this, which was, if you look at, like, for instance, like a civil war that's happening at some country, across the globe, and you're like, I can't believe people would do that to each other. What's wrong with those people? Well, if you grew up in the system that they grew up in, their behavior would make a lot of sense. The things around them have shaped their narratives, which have shaped their emotions in a way that's all, to them, very logical most of the time. And the key is for us to understand, how did these systems and structures create all these different behaviors and stuff like that. I love that idea. It's a very empathetic idea of, like, you can almost, within reason, you can understand almost anyone's point of view, even if you, and still disagree with it.
Oh, yeah.
It's just understanding how they got to that point of view. But we've lost. That is not, I mean, I say we lost, like there was some golden era where we had it. There wasn't. But we are objectively bad about that as humans, especially with social media. And I am chief of sinners here. It is so hard to remember that someone else's point of view makes sense to them for a set of reasons that if you saw them would make sense to you, even if you disagreed with it.
That's true. But that doesn't mean, especially in the work that you're doing, that truth doesn't need to be spoken, and that injustice doesn't need to be pointed out. And I'll take you a step further, as you're talking about, Stanley using this example of understanding and stuff. Every behavior that a person, I don't know what the right verb of that is. Every behavior that a person acts out is an attempt to get a need that's gone unmet met.
Yes.
Every behavior is an attempt to get an unmet need met. And so if you can understand the need, you can understand the motivation, you can understand the behavior. Because especially within the spiritual root system, feelings always lead to needs. And so if we can understand how we feel, then we can understand what we need, what that feeling is telling us that we need. And then we can, and this is like PhD level feelings work here, we can ask another person to meet that need for us.
Whew. Yeah, that's vulnerability.
Yeah,
right
that's
there.
why I'm saying it's PhD level stuff.
No, totally. I'm gosh, how many years? I should know this without having to pause and think. 8 years into marriage, and feel like I'm just now starting to dip my toe into that part of the pool of being like, I actually just said this to my wife recently. I know that this is an area of woundedness and brokenness for me. I know I'm not operating out of a place. I know I'm operating out of a place of unhealth. However, in this moment, would it be possible for you to do this? It's like, cause that's just what I need at this moment right now. And it's not in an unhealthy way, not something that was unhealthy, but just like explaining to her, I'm not asking this because I think it's objectively right or fair for me to ask it. It's just with where I'm at right now. If you were able to, that would be a big
that makes me think,
I was like, wow,
that makes me think you're trying to apply logic to feelings, and feelings aren't logical. Feelings are irrational. Like they don't apply to, well, this makes sense, or this is right, or this is wrong. And so inherently by asking for a need to be met, you're doing something that is potentially illogical, but you're doing something that's coming from a place of who you truly are and engaging with your emotions, and you're being vulnerable with another person, especially a spouse. And I mean, and you said 8 years, like we just crossed the threshold of 2 years. And so I'm behind you in time. But one of the things that I've learned, in my 2 years of being married, 3 years of being with Leanne. It's that
Mm-hmm.
marriage doesn't make intimacy and vulnerability easier. In fact, I think it
No.
actually makes it more difficult because
Correct.
it's just a constant ramping up of discovering not only who your spouse truly is, but really more of who you really are.
Well, no, 100%. I mean, to keep circling back around to the framework of this podcast, no, it's because what happens in marriage is you realize you've had an Ed Harris yelling at you all your life. You just didn't know it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, all of a sudden, you have another person in your life who's like, hey, why are you doing that? Why are you acting that way? Like, what's going on in there? And they're poking at that screaming voice. And you, for the first time, you're having to realize, like, oh, there's an opportunity for me to not live out of this pain, out of this brokenness, out of this dysfunction, out of this whatever. But the first step toward that is usually anger, resentment, frustration, insecurity. And it's like, no, you're the problem, you know? And I mean, so much of marriage is being given the opportunity to see the unhealthy patterns in your life that you're thinking and feeling and be better, to choose health or unhealth in areas that you would have never seen on your own.
Yes, and I think even if your spouse doesn't necessarily say, "Hey, what's going on? Why are you doing that?" Maybe they just in their true self
Yeah.
and in the
Yeah.
present moment reflect to you that really hurt me. They just
Totally. Yeah.
they
Yeah. Yeah.
just show you the effects of your behavior on another person, wherein
Yeah.
it's only lived in the intrapersonal system of what's inside of you for so long. Now it's having the chance to interact with another
Mm-hmm.
person. That could be enough in just on its own
Oh,
to
exactly
go,
right.
oh,
Yeah.
I need to reflect on this. I need to see what's going on inside of me so that it doesn't slosh all out on my spouse.
That's actually, I mean, that's a much better way of phrasing what I was trying to say, which is the way I normally describe it is that Christina, just by the nature of being my wife, Christina, just by the nature of being her, um, exposed things in me that I didn't even know were there. Not because she was trying
Yeah.
to, just
Oh
by
yeah.
her being her, put a spotlight on areas of me that I'd kept hidden for years and years and years. And not because she's trying to be like, be better, but just by nature of being
She's just
a
being present.
empathetic,
She's just
huh?
being present,
Yeah,
but truly
totally.
present.
And in key areas where I wasn't, and this works the other way as well, but there's key areas where I was deeply unaware or unhealthy, where she was healthier, and just her being healthy forced me to realize, oh, I'm not acting out of a healthy way. I'd kept a barrier between me and people, for most of my life, and all of a sudden I'm trying to lean into this incredibly intimate relationship with my spouse, and for the first time I'm having to see stuff I didn't even know was
Yeah.
there. I think it's very possible I never would have had to see my sexual abuse for what it was if I hadn't gotten married, because it just, the longer I was with her, the fewer places there were for that stuff to hide.
Yeah.
It just, all that stuff started coming to the surface. And what a gift. I mean, probably less so for her when she had to go through what I was going through, but like, what a gift for me to be able to like be a more healthy, kind, loving
But
person.
I think that's one of the things that I have discovered and has been such an incredible gift to me, uh, through therapy, through learning what healthy intimacy really is, and finally through being in relationship to Leanne. It's that,
Mm,
a healthy relationship helps you become more of who you truly are. It
100%.
doesn't inhibit you or move you in the other way. It helps bring out who you really are and help. What's funny is I can really just say this. I can say two things with one sentence. It helps Josh be more Josh, and that's that's
Mm-hmm.
true for you and true for me.
I see
There
what
you
you did
go.
there.
There you go.
Yeah. And to like, if I can quickly one last time God card this conversation, it's like, that's what's so true about Christianity. It's a relationship. And if the relationship is real and true, it should be bringing out the healthiest, most alive, most vibrant version of you.
Yeah.
That's like, my advice to people who are like, so many people, and I'm guessing so many of your listeners have grown up with a religion that was a repressive religion that said repress who you are, push away who you are, push away your feelings. It felt like a limitation. to please someone else. And I would say the most healthy, fullest expression of Christianity should be feel like you are coming alive, like you are becoming the person you were created to be.
Yeah. Well, I think that's why it's so important, Josh, once again, for you to be a voice of somebody who is speaking out and saying this way that this thing
Yeah.
has been for so long isn't the way that it was meant to be. Because a lot of the people that I work with in my practice, a lot of the colleagues that I interact with carry with them traumas from the church.
Yeah.
And because of that, they are at best hesitant to engage with it. At worst, absolutely refuse to do it. And that's not me saying I'm not faulting them at all. I'm just saying that
and rightly so.
these
With what they've experienced, how would they feel any other way than that?
yes, and so that's why I'll go back to, a person who is acting as a voice to say, I have also been hurt by this.
Yeah.
I have chosen to continue to engage in it, and I currently choose to believe that it can be something more. However, and I think I saw this on your feed not too long ago, it's going to take a lot of work.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't be afraid of the work, but also, and I don't have an answer to this, we shouldn't be responsible for correcting the system that's hurt us.
No. I mean, I would never say it's a survivor's responsibility to explain to the church all the things they've gotten wrong. In the same way, it's not a Black person's responsibility to explain the rest of us what systemic racial injustice looks like. It's not their job. It's our freaking job to figure it out. Now, for me, I feel like my experiences have led to kind of this like calling, and not just with sexual abuse, but in a lot of areas. But I mean, no, I would say, to someone who has been deeply hurt and wounded by the church, I wouldn't call them even necessarily back to the church. I would just more call them back to Jesus and say, like, I think there's a God worth falling in love with. And then you can figure out what to do with all of that. But to the church itself, I'd be like, figure your crap out or close your doors, because like it's
you're messing people up.
It's too important. It's too important of a message to keep doing this. And there are systemic problems. I mean, and so many systemic problems. And so, I mean, I think part of the burden I feel is to try to be a voice that's saying, be better, which isn't necessarily always the kindest way to say it and not appreciated, but to people in power, be better.
Well, I think
you've got to do
if nothing else, it is accountability, because for so long, the system that abused was the system that silenced. And, if nothing else, be better is a call to say, you may have hurt me, but you haven't silenced me, and I will keep speaking out until something changes. And I think that that's very admirable and commendable, and I think you're very brave.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that.
To make an awkward transition, one of the, I kind of spoke to, maybe this movie isn't such a bad thing to show people. One of the reasons why I said that was, if psychology counseling in and of itself is not that old of a career. It hasn't been around for very long, less than 100 years. And if you look back into its history and its origins, and you look back into the origins of a lot of the modalities that therapists practice using, the worldviews, almost all of them started with somebody treating schizophrenia. Like nearly all of them started with so-and-so was working, and a lot of them started out of Palo Alto, California. So-and-so was working with their schizophrenic clients and discovered blah, 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 blah. And so this movie took place somewhere in the 1950 range, 1950s,
Sure.
somewhere in there. So you're really seeing it. It's like the beginning of the crest of that wave. So like electroshock was a real thing. It was the that was before, we as a psychological community, knew anything about medications, knew anything about helping people process trauma, knew anything about really walking with somebody through something. Now, I don't think John Nash would have benefited much from talk therapy. But in the case of a personality disorder, before you can get to any kind of talk therapy, you've got to help a person become stable. And so, like in those cases, it may be medication is the best aid. And then once a person has leveled out a little more, then you can start processing some stuff and trying to understand. And in some cases, even helping with some behavioral modifications. So another thing that I want to ask you is, tell me something that you've learned from people that you have worked with, either in the church or people that you've interviewed or people that you've worked with maybe on the journalism side of things.
I think the thing that both as someone who has been in and currently in some ways is in a leadership role in the church, one of the things I've been grappling a lot with is, what does healthy leadership look like? And specifically how that intersects with how do you tell if someone's a healthy leader? Because like whether it's been dealing with like abuse, narcissism, power structures that are leveraged to harm people, all that kind of stuff. So much of that has to do with sort of that health of the person and how you can determine it. But then also just as I've looked in my own life, in my own role, and I think one of the big things that I'm grappling with is, man, I think we have overrated sort of the charismatic leader. We have created such an idol of that in our culture, both in churches and in America. And I think there's something really dangerous about how we gravitate toward the charismatic, big idea person. And I always felt like that was the person I was supposed to be. If I was going to be a good leader, then I would be this person who always knew the right answer and always had great ideas and always knew what to do next and blah, 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 blah. And I more and more find myself wondering if healthy people usually are that way. Like, I think maybe there's probably some examples of people who can be really wired that way and be healthy. But by and large, I see that as being someone who hasn't dealt with, like, whatever is driving them has largely gone undealt with. And they're just like responding externally. And I find myself in both my writing and in my observation of healthy leaders around me, the leaders that I trust the most are the ones who seem to gladly take a back seat, who don't need to make their personality front and center, who are willing to build something but not build it around the cult of them. And it can be really seductive, and it happens in churches all the time. I don't know. I guess I don't need to name examples, but there are plenty of prime examples I could name off right now of leaders who have had major, massive flaws. And they are the people that I was told, like, in my ministry life, like, oh, these are the people who get it. These are the people that emulate. And I don't know, man. I think there's this part of me that just feels like and so I guess the learning for me is I would just rather operate out of kind of like what we were talking about before. I'd rather operate out of humility of my limitations than feel the need to be the great grand leader who knows everything.
Well, that's what I was going to say.
And I think I would like our church cultures to build that.
If a leader portrays that they are a person who has an answer for everything, I would say there's no way that person has humility, because you have not yet engaged in everything. You haven't experienced everything. And let's look at some of the biggest issues that we're facing today. Like, if you are in a community that is ethically diverse and you are trying to find a way to engage in people who look differently than you, and you want to say that you have the answer to hundreds of years of systemic racism, then buddy, you're not the person that's going to find that answer.
Man, that's a good point.
Rather, it's going to come from the hard work of being humble and going and asking questions.
Yes.
Rather than making statements.
Listening. Yeah, absolutely. And being willing to learn, and for it not just to be, even that listening and learning can be performative. It can be like, look at how I'm just going to like listen to these group of people. I'm like, no, it has to be a lifetime of that.
Yeah.
Like, it has to be a lifetime of being willing to sit and listen and learn. And the problem is that slows down growth.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a terrible growth strategy.
But but humility leads to relationship. Which is that ongoing thing. It's like you're saying. So true humility, it's not going to be limited to an era. to a time, to a
Mm-hmm.
limited time offer, but rather it's humbling going to another, starting a relationship and continuing that relationship and knowing I don't have all the answers. You don't have all the answers, but
Mm-hmm.
maybe, just maybe, we can take some steps together.
Yeah, and I think my encouragement, like the thing I find myself moving toward across the board, and this is not just the church, this is very much politics as well. I think we need to ask ourselves the hard questions of like, why are we so attracted to these kind of leaders? What base need
Oh,
are
I can
they
already tell you that.
alleged? Oh, I could too. I'm. You were delicate before, so I'm being
There you
delicate
go.
now.
There you
But
go.
I think we as a culture need to ask ourselves, why are we so attracted to these sort of leaders, and what is it doing to
Oh, well,
us?
no, I wasn't speaking
And
politically. I was saying we're attracted to that because it's easier to receive definitive answers than it is to live in the tension, to live
but that is, but like all politics and all cable news shows are offering you
right.
definitive
And
answers,
that's
right? On both
yeah,
sides.
yeah.
I'm not, at this point, I'm not going to say both sides equally, but both sides do this. They said, if you do this, if you vote for me, I will do this and I will provide you with all the
Yep.
answers. And it's like, we're like, ooh, that. And it's like, man, I think the best leaders, I mean, even look at like, if you study the life of Lincoln, arguably one of the few legitimately redeemable great presidents that we've had. It's like he actually was pretty honest with people that he didn't know what he was doing and that he was trying to figure it out as he went along, and surrounded himself with a lot of wise voices and a lot of wise counsel. And it's like he would never get elected today.
Yeah.
We don't want that kind of person. We are attracted toward people who make us feel, I don't have to worry about anything. This person's going to run my
Yep.
life. And it's like, don't do that.
Yep.
No good.
So let's say that somebody was listening to our conversation today and they would love to maybe engage with you more. What's the best way that they can do that? Usually I say they want to see you as a client, but you're not a therapist. So
I am not a therapist.
plug away.
You should not come to me for therapy. That would be irresponsible. Yeah, if you've heard me talk for 2 hours and are thinking I need more of this Josh guy, you can go to Joshua Pease, Pease, joshuapease.co is my website. Check out some of the stuff I've written there. All the articles we talked about today are on there. You can also, if you're so inclined, you can email me through that. Follow me on Twitter if you really want to see the full why Josh Treese thought I was an 8 unleashed, Joshua DPs. Other than that, I think in the next month I've got an article. This is completely out of nowhere. I think I have an article for Popular Mechanics about why our brains are fascinated by conspiracy theories coming out in the next month. So,
well, Josh, I can't even thank you enough for coming on today. Any conversation with you, I walk away from just extremely glad that I had it and challenged. And I always feel like, because you always do your best to show up with who you really are, I always feel like something inside of me, some need inside of me was met. And on top of that, to have the chance to just tell you how much you've impacted me and the place that you hold in my story, and just to tell you thanks for that is so meaningful. And I appreciate it, and I appreciate you so much. So just thanks for coming on.
that's deeply humbling, man. Thank you.
Nice.
I really appreciate that.
All right.
And I was honored to be a part of the podcast. This was fun.
Boom. Well, thank you, sir. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the wrap-up of today's show. I can't even begin to describe how much I loved talking with Joshua. I know this part may be confusing, seeing as how I'm doing the wrap-up solo and both of us have the same name. But it was just such an honor, and there's a few things that I wanted to kind of touch on again. The first being that I think a byproduct, a kind of cool result that is happening of me doing the show is that I have had the chance every now and then, and I'm thinking back to the episode I did with Dr. Sarah Hopkins, the episode I did with Dr. Chip Dodd, the episode I did with Todd Werbers, Jared Farley. I'm having the chance to express to people who have meant so much on my personal journey just how much I appreciate them, and not only how they've affected me personally, but they've affected me clinically as well. Because like anybody else, yes, I may be a therapist, but I'm a person first. I've perhaps more than anybody got a bad case of being a person, and so I, you know, live my life as a person first. And as a therapist, I don't even know if it's second. It may be third, fourth, or fifth. But, you know, things that run through my personal life inevitably have the chance to affect my clinical life, especially if those personal things led to movement in my clinical career. And so just to have the chance to tell Josh about a conversation, which he even said, you know, he was unaware of it, that he and I had 11 years ago that left such a lasting impression on my life was just incredible. And that I get to kind of circle back over a decade later and tell him thank you and how much he means is a great, incredible chance. I just think so much of him, and so to have him as a guest on the show was awesome. The second thing I wanted to highlight is Josh concentrated a little bit on the relationship between John Nash and that Ed Harris played in the movie, and how Ed Harris, while a figment of John's, I don't want to say imagination, but disorder, the relationship between the two, and how Ed Harris's character was constantly, talking down to him, yelling at him, shouting at him, and Josh relating that to the negative self-talk that we can have inside of our own head, the negative core messages that we end up believing at a very deep level, living our life according to. And I just wanted to highlight that because I think that, negative self-talk is a result of faulty core beliefs. It's something that all of us deal with to varying degrees. And so if you are experiencing that, if you're somebody who constantly is putting yourself down, is living in doubt, is living in kind of the presence of an oppressive, negative self-voice, I want to tell you that you're not alone. You're not the only person experiencing that. And if a result of that negative self-talk is shame, and you're feeling shame for that, then that shame is going to tell you you are the only one, and nobody else is going to understand. But I want to zero in on this right now. You don't have to listen to that shame. I'm telling you right now, you got a bad case of being a person. You're part of a very, very inclusive club, because everybody on earth is a part of that same club, and every one of us experiences negative self-talk. So the third thing I kind of wanted to highlight, what can you do about it? What can you do if negative self-talk, if shame is running your life? Well, the first thing I want to encourage you to do is to talk about it with somebody, because shame, negative self-talk, these inner faulty core beliefs, they can only be helped if they're expressed, because if you keep them inside, no one else is going to know about them. And so practicing healthy intimacy within the context of a caring friendship, relationship of any kind, somebody that you trust, talking about these things with that type of person helps to kind of get them out of your head, get them into the world, and let another person kind of sniff around them, take a look at them, and bounce them off somebody else. The second thing that I would encourage you to do, really anybody to do, and of course I'm going to say this because I'm a big advocate for it because it's my career, but find a therapist that you can mesh with, that you can be a good fit with, and begin seeing them. Therapy was the catalyst for so much understanding and connection and change in my own life. And a lot of the work of my therapy was identifying first, and then examining the faulty core messages that I was believing about myself. And kind of by highlighting those, drawing those out, I was able to change them, to choose another message to live by. And I know that the way that I'm saying that right now sounds very simple and easy and quick. It wasn't. but just trying to be concise in it, There's also several books that would be good resources to read. Look up Kristen Neff on Amazon. She has a lot of stuff on self-compassion that I think would be extremely helpful. And that's the wrap up. So thanks so much to my guest, Joshua Pease. Thanks so much for listening to the show. It's because of you that Therapist Theater has made it as far as it did, 48 episodes with this one. Next week, the episode that is released will be the last one for 2019, which is crazy. And then, of course, Christmas the following week, we're going to be taking Christmas off, and then the following week off, so we'll be gone for 2 weeks, and then coming back on with the first episode of Season 2 on January the 9th, 2020, which is a Thursday. So we're actually switching the release day from Wednesday to Thursday. I think we can call it a show. I'm going to say that you can raise the lights, lower the curtain, and say that for this week, the theater is closed.